Welcome back to my series of pre-1970s reviews. We're getting closer to the end of the year. We've done one every single month, and this month we're going to be talking about Peeping Tom, a film directed by British filmmaker Michael Powell, director of such films as A Matter of Life and Death or The Red Shoes. He was Oscar nominated for Best Writing for One of Our Aircraft is Missing. And then in 1960 he released a little film called Peeping Tom, a film that showed the point of view of a killer as he stalked his female victims. It received a critical mauling, did horribly at the box office, was barely released in the States until many years later, and effectively destroyed Michael Powell's career. But the film maintained a cult status throughout the 1970s and eventually gained a lot more popularity when filmmakers like Martin Scorsese listed it as one of their favorite films. And later, Scorsese helped to actually re-release the film, which got it to an even wider audience. And now today, it's considered a masterpiece of psychological horror and one of the earliest slasher films. The film follows a photographer for hire and a focus puller on Hollywood sets named Mark Lewis, who uses a movie camera to film women as they die, because he has an obsession with capturing that moment of fear, and he's never able to fully grasp that moment. And he has a bit of a perverse attraction to fear. We learn throughout the film that he was raised by a scientist. His father studied him when he was young, often recorded him and tried to frighten him, or recorded him while he watched a couple kissing in a park. His father was obsessed with capturing those moments and understanding how fear went through the body of a child. And so naturally, he didn't have the greatest youth. And as an adult now, he's inherited some of this obsession. He finds himself as an adult consumed with the desire to watch other people. We today call that voyeurism, and this film definitely blurs the line between what a movie can do as a fictional piece of art, but also introducing what a movie really does and have that be the main character's psychosis. Because we're following a man who's obsessed with watching other people, and he takes it to extremes. But as fans of movies, when we sit in a theater, that's exactly what we're doing. We're watching, the fictional, sometimes non-fictional lives of other people play out before our eyes, and we're the voyeurs in that situation. And so this movie has a very unique way of combining similar themes, watching art and living art. Roger Ebert talked about this considerably in his review of the film, where he said the movies make us into voyeurs. We sit in the dark watching other people's lives. It is the bargain the cinema strikes with us, although most films are too well behaved to mention it. Today, Peeping Tom is tame by comparison to other films we've seen just from the 1970s alone, or later in the 60s. There isn't even any on-screen violence. There's one little moment of blood, but for the most part, all of the violence is implied. There is nudity, which today is considered one of the first instances of full frontal female nudity in a British film, but it's extremely brief and, by, again, today's standards, tasteful. Nevertheless, this film still deeply disturbed critics of 1960, and as a result, Alfred Hitchcock chose not to have a press screening of Psycho, which obviously is a considerably more violent film, but was still a big success, whereas Peeping Tom wasn't, and it took many years to receive a critical reappraisal, which today, as I have already said, it's considered a horror masterpiece. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about this movie is because it does sort of interest me when I think about just how much power a film critic actually has over a filmmaker, because those initial critics and the reception to this film in 1960 kind of tanked Michael Powell's career, even though he was an Oscar nominee. And I've said this many times in reviews, and I'll say it again, being a film critic is considerably easier than being a filmmaker. The filmmaker has the hard job. The film critic just has to sit there and watch it. It's people like Michael Powell who decide to make a film like Peeping Tom that's totally different and very subversive and extremely dangerous. And because of films like that, we now today, as artists, can explore deeper and darker themes. And we have films like this to thank for it. Thankfully, it's also a really damn good movie, extremely well directed. Some of the shots are actually framed like a photograph. The exploration of this dark and tormented character portrayed by Karl Böhm, not sure if I pronounced his name right, I genuinely think this is one of the greatest performances in film. He had such a difficult job in that he had to portray someone who, up until then in cinema, was always like this man masked in shadow, holding a gun, and you're supposed to hate him. He has no personality, and the murder is in no way sympathetic. And this film portrays this character as sympathetic, even though we witness through his POV the murder of various women, and yet the film depicts him as a bit of an anti-hero. You're not supposed to look at him and condone what he's doing, but it's most certainly a portrait of a tortured man, and it's asking you to understand how he got to that point in his life. And we do, because it's just so well told as we experience scenes where he is showing this girl that he is starting to fall in love with, who lives beneath him, video from his childhood. The mother, who is blind, in one of the best scenes in the film, shows up in this studio and horrifies him when she starts to ask him all of these very invasive questions. And it's these performances and this dark portrayal of a sympathetic villain, even though he's our lead, that make this film still effective all these years later. And you can also interpret what he suffers from in totally different ways. It can be viewed as a sexual problem, and there are certainly hints of that as he takes his fingers and runs his hands along the tripod of his camera. But it could also be viewed entirely from the perspective of mental trauma, that this character just does not know another form of life because of how he spent his childhood. This is not only a fascinating film with an incredible lead performance, it's also a fascinating story to how it came about, how film critics of the era destroyed it, and how later film critics and filmmakers like Martin Scorsese were gratefully smart enough to say, hey, you guys were wrong. This movie is definitely worth your time. And I highly suggest checking out Peeping Tom if you've never seen it, especially if you're a big horror fan, because it's kind of integral to the development of horror in cinema. I'm going to give Peeping Tom an A. Guys, thank you so much as always for watching. I wanted to talk about a scary film at the end of September because we're getting into October, which is my favorite month of the whole year. We're going to be talking about a lot of scary movies next month. Look forward to that, guys. Thank you so much for continuing to watch this series. And as always, if you like this, you can click right here and get Stuckmanized.